Hi, I'm Tim. In this video, we'll go through 8 tips for a successful first flight for your radio control model aircraft. Let's get to it. In today's video, we're going to go through 8 tips to help you get a successful first flight of your radio control model airplane. These tips come from my 50 years of flying radio control model aircraft, my time as a Part 91 light aircraft flight instructor, and my time flying as a commercial airline pilot. In summary, an airplane is an airplane, so a lot of the lessons we learn on full-scale aviation can be applied to model aviation. The first tip on a successful first flight are your control surfaces. You want to make absolutely certain that your control surfaces go in the right direction with your transmitter. The classic mistake on this are ailerons hooked up backwards. By the time you realize this happens, it's too late on the first takeoff, and there's been many an aircraft, to include full scale, that just roll into the ground after that. So we'll do it in a second on the e-flite timber to make sure that the control surfaces move in the correct direction with the sticks on your transmitter. Important for a maiden flight as well as any other flight. The other thing we'll do is we'll check that the controls move the correct distance on your transmitter. With the advanced transmitters, we can adjust the throw of the control surface, full throw for acrobatic flight, a lesser control throw for normal regular flights. For maiden flight, for sure, you're going to be in the lower control setting. If you accidentally take off on the higher control setting, there'll be extremely sensitive controls. It's just not something that you want to worry about for a first flight. In line with the proper throws, you want to know what switches are on the transmitter to increase the throw or do other things like flaps. Just run through that before you take off so you're familiar where those are. The final thing on the first tip of the controls is ground steering. Your airplane will have either a tail wheel or a nose gear that will steer the aircraft on the ground until it takes off. Do your best to make sure this wheel is straight and lined up so when you take off, the aircraft doesn't turn one way or the other because of a misaligned steering wheel. It's just one less thing to worry about to go wrong on your initial flight. Tip number 2 for successful first flight is the center of gravity. All aircraft have a balance point called the center of gravity, whether it's a 747 or your RC model. It is imperative that the aircraft balance to that center of gravity. Somewhere in the instructions for an almost ready to fly or on the plans if you built a model will be a CG or center of gravity. If you've lost that or you can't find the instructions, typically a point 25 to 30% in from the wing leading edge is a reasonable point for a center of gravity. You can literally put your fingers under the wing at that point and just make sure the model balances at that point literally level. Keep in mind that you want to configure the model the way it's going to fly. If it's a gas-powered model, a full fuel tank, the electric-powered model, put the battery in place to make sure that it has the correct components in it as you check the center of gravity. If there's doubt for the center of gravity, if it's a little bit nose heavy, the plane will probably fly okay, be a little bit sluggish on the controls. If the model is tail heavy, it's a much different discussion. Tail heavy models could be uncontrollable. There may not be enough elevator authority. Just don't fly with a tail heavy center of gravity. Try to center it, a little bit nose heavy, but absolutely no tail heavy for the center of gravity. Number 3 for successful first flight is to make sure your wings and tail surfaces are warp free. There can be no warps in your wing for sure, your tail surfaces also. If it's a almost ready to fly model like the e-flite timber with a very solid foam wing, very little concerns about a warped wing just due to the nature of the foam construction. If it's a model with a balsa frame like this wing from the Guilo Arrow, it's fairly lightweight with the iron-on plastic. You could induce some sort of twisting mechanism. Just sight it to make sure that it is flat. If it's a flat bottom, you can put it on a table, and if it's off a little bit, just twist it with a heat gun, take out that warp. The key thing is to fly without any warps on your wing. Item number 4 are your batteries. You have 2 sets of batteries when you fly. The batteries on the aircraft. In the case of the e-flite timber, it's a lithium polymer battery. And then you have the batteries on your transmitter. For my DX6, there are 4 AA cells in the back. It's very important to make sure that for the flight batteries, they're fully charged. It is possible you could fly a previous flight with those batteries in another airplane. They're halfway discharged. You forget to charge them up. You'll install the battery, everything will work fine. You're planning on a 5 to 7 minute flight, but because the batteries are halfway discharged, after 2 minutes, all of a sudden it starts powering down. You just want to avoid that if at all possible. by charging the batteries. And what I do is I charge the batteries the night before so that everything's set when I go out to the field. By the same token, I do not have rechargeable batteries in my transmitter. They're AA cells. There is a very handy voltage readout on the main screen, so I can tell you what the voltage is. Also, I know from the instruction manual, I wrote down here 4.3 volts is the minimum. It'll warn me with a voice command. Make sure that you have proper voltage above 4.3 volts in your transmitter. And what I do is I bring a fresh set of 4 batteries in my field box to the field so I can install the batteries if the transmitter is low. Tip number 5 is safety. We want to be safe all the time we fly, especially with the first flight of an aircraft. We don't know if maybe there's an error with the transmitter programming, wiring. The main safety thing to be concerned about is the electric motor inadvertently starting up. So for the maiden flight, assume that when you connect the battery to your airplane and it's powered up, if there's something wrong, the aircraft motor could spring to life. It's a very surprising event when it happens. If you're standing in front of the airplane could fly into you. You're probably going to put a hand out to stop it. So now I've installed the battery to my e-flite timber. We'll take a look at the timber. You can see the plane is pointed away from me. If the battery starts up, there's no danger of it hitting me. I'm behind the airplane. Another nice safety feature, note the lights on the wingtip on the back. This is an almost ready to fly plane. The lights came with it. It's a great little safety feature because you know that there's power on the airplane. So what we're going to do now is check that the controls move in the proper direction. So the elevator should go up, down, rudder, left, right. You'll notice it matches the sticks, aileron, left and right. Then the flaps is this stick right here, so you want to remember where the stick is. So you notice the ailerons, this is the low setting. This is a switch. Notice it's a high setting right there, so high and low. You want to make sure you take off in the low setting for the ailerons. Same way for the elevator, up, and then for the high setting is here. You want to make sure that is set. And the same for the rudder. We go over here, the low setting, and then there's the high setting right there. So again, proper direction and proper control throw and knowledge of the switches before you take off in that first flight. A great built-in safety feature is the throttle. What we don't want to do is to turn on our transmitter with the throttle setting high. If we've connected the aircraft to the battery and this throttle system is high and we turn it on with the older radios, depending on receivers and ESCs, the electric motor could burst into full throttle because you have the throttle setting on. Now the airplane is not turned on, but I'll show you what happens as a safety feature when we turn on this transmitter with the throttle setting accidentally high. It'll actually tell you that as a warning.
Warning, throttle high.
Okay, so that's all you need to know. You put the throttle low and things are good to go on that. So again, just knowledge of your computer-based radio. Safety tip number 6 is to do a range check. In the old days with our radios, to make sure that the radio had proper range, we typically had an extended antenna, would push that down to minimize the range, walk away from the model, wiggling the control surface to make sure that things still worked. With these modern radios, the DX6 has a built-in antenna, which is just wonderful for safety and reliability, but there is a built-in range test function in the transmitter that gives us an assurance that the radio is within range. So again, if we look at the screen here, we have 5.7 volts. That's above the minimum 4.3. To get to the range check function, we push in the scroll wheel, and on the main menu, we just go down until we go to range test right there. This says range test full power, and what we do is with the bind training switch at top on this radio, watch, we push that down and it's in reduced power mode. The test distance is 30 meters. So by holding this down, reduced power, we simply walk away from the model 30 meters, which is about 90 feet, 30 paces. With that button held down, if the control surfaces work, you've done a successful range check of your model with this feature of the transmitter. Tip number 7 for successful first flight of your RC model is to have a mental game plan thinking out of that first takeoff. So the first thing we consider is the wind. We always like to take off into the wind if at all possible. However, there might be times when we'll accept a slight tailwind for a takeoff that I'll explain later with sun angle. All aircraft can take off with a tailwind. It's just going to be a little bit higher takeoff speed. In the 777, we could take off with a 10-knot tailwind. We would do that from time to time for traffic purposes, noise abatement. Where you might consider a slight tailwind for your first takeoff is the sun angle. If you're out of the field in the morning or the evening, there's a very low sun angle. If you take off your model into the headwind, but you're going to turn right into a sun, you might consider putting the sun to your back so that you can do that initial flight with the sun to your back to have a clear view of the model. Again, it'll depend on your experience, the amount of wind, but a slight tailwind is not a deal killer if you can keep the sun behind you on that takeoff. The other thing that is good on a takeoff is consider which direction you're going to turn. Is it going to be a left turn or right turn? You're probably going to do a couple oval turns over the field. If you just think ahead, I'm going to turn left at a lower altitude, just one less thing to think about. The other thing that I'd recommend for a first flight is professional courtesy. Every RC pilot at your club field has had a first flight at some point in time. There's a lot going on. You're thinking about a lot of things. Talk to your fellow pilots, explain you're going to do a maiden flight, and they'll happily clear out at, say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you're going to do it, so they can, first of all, watch your flight, and now you have the field and airspace all to yourself. When you are by yourself on that takeoff, you can get fairly close to the runway. If your club rules permit, you can even stand on the runway, so you watch the model taking off straight in front of you. It's just one less thing you have to worry about if you're standing sideways to the runway trying to steer the model down the runway. Successful first flight is one word: airspeed. There's an old story of a World War II flying training squadron commander talking to the cadets on their first day at school, talking about their future to be a military pilot. And the commander would say, I'm going to give you 3 things to think about to successfully complete this course. The first thing is keep your airspeed. Number 2 is to keep your airspeed. Number 3 is to keep your airspeed. Airspeed is very important for full-scale aircraft as well as our models. So just make sure that you have sufficient airspeed. Don't get slow. That's one thing you want to avoid with a first flight, especially with a bigger or heavier model. Keep in mind the models fly with an airspeed. They don't really know or care about their ground speed, but as RC pilots, we're on the ground, so we're flying the model by ground speed. That's just the way it is. What you do is when you're flying into the headwind, realize your ground speed, the speed of the shadow of the ground will be a little bit less, but the airspeed is fine. The important thing is when you turn downwind, you'll have a higher ground speed, but the same airspeed. Just realize you're going to have to fly faster from your ground perspective going downwind than you are going upwind. Thank you for joining me on this video. If you like this and would like to see future content, it's greatly helpful for me to subscribe and hit the like button. And again, there are 8 things to think of for a successful first flight. Your control surfaces are set up properly, the right amount, the proper direction. You have a proper center of gravity. There are no warps on your wing or tail flying surfaces. Your batteries are properly charged. Think safety at all times. Do a range check. Think through the first flight. Keep up your airspeed. If you can follow these 8 tips, you will be well on your way to a successful first flight of your radio control model airplane.